Thank you very much for everybody for joining us today. I hope everyone is doing fine at the day 50 of the MCO. And just let me introduce myself. My name is Ivy, and I am the Research Director of Research for Social Advancement, REFSA. So today our topic is Build Back Better, constructing our post-COVID-19 future. I know it sounds a little bit daunting, but we do have three very distinguished guests joining us today. And they are Mr. Niloy Banerjee, from the United Nations Development Program. He is the resident representative for Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei Darussalam. And then we have Her Excellency Maria Castillo Fernandez, the Ambassador and Head of Delegation of the European Union to Malaysia. And last but not least, we have Dr. Khor Kheng, who is a health system specialist and currently pursuing his postgraduate in the University of Oxford. So before I begin, I would just like to remind everybody that there is a Q&A function at the bottom. And I would like to encourage you to post your question there. And if the question is for a specific speakers, do specify which speakers it is directed to. So let us start. And so I think by now it is a known fact that the COVID-19 pandemic has caused great disruption across the world. It has not only taken lives, but it has also threatened to take away the livelihood of many people. But as we respond to the immediate needs to save lives and to save the economy, we must also remember that whatever we do now, the policy response that we create now will have the long-term implications, and in a way it will determine the length and the severity of the crisis, how long we can emerge from the crisis, and also how our future will look like. So I think that the COVID-19 has offered many lessons and also revealed some of the vulnerabilities that we have as a society, as an economy. So even though we can't really predict how things will unfold, we do know that we must take active steps to make sure that we seize this opportunity to build back better for our society and not waste this crisis. So without further ado, I would first like to invite our first speaker, Her Excellency Maria Castillo Fernandez, to give his remark from a European perspective. Your Excellency, please.
Thank you, Abby. I am unable to start the video. I don't know, it's because you... or is it?
Can I help you with that?
Ivy, you need to permit video for all the speakers.
Sure. Let me do that. Okay. Okay, I found it. Perhaps you can start while I'm trying to figure that out.
Okay. No problem. A very good Selamat and Kahari to all of you. And thank you to the Researcher for Social Advancement for having me here today, and to share some thoughts on how could be this build back better for everyone that we are all trying to figure out. Let me just start saying that, of course, this crisis has been a shock. I would say a global shock, which started with a human health emergency and then turned into an unprecedented economic and social crisis. And what I could say is the first lesson is that we cannot do it in national terms. We cannot think in isolation and only in an inward-looking way. We have to rebuild together. We have to have a common approach. And therefore, my first message is clear. We need a big doses of international and regional cooperation. And we have seen, for example, ASEAN countries getting together also, to try very quickly to put some solutions at the first phase of the pandemic. So international cooperation is key for whatever building back better that we want to achieve. Then second is that I don't think we are going to a situation where everything has to change, but mostly, you know, the crisis will accelerate some of the dynamics that, yeah, okay, I'm here. Some of the dynamic and the trends that were already there before the crisis. So that is where we are going. And I think one of these trends has been vulnerability of health systems, healthcare systems. We know that in many countries now we are looking to greater health security, to what we think of, you know, trying to find ways to strengthen our care system, which have been really put into a maximum of what they could do. And therefore we have to find ways, you know, to try and find what will be the best way to strengthen them. And health is seen, therefore, in a more of a public global good, you know, something that we need to create together and that we need to share. And that comes to, you know, the first thing that Europe has been trying to do, try to pool resources, trying to find treatments for vaccines, for treatment, for testings, and that we are trying to do that accessible to all. And you have all seen, you know, the big pledging conference that we had on Monday, trying to find, you know, trying to bring everyone on board, stakeholders, governments, you know, whatever actors that was willing to help in this endeavor. You know, Prime Minister Muhyiddin said the other day in the acceleration initiative that we have with WHO, that it was through international solidarity that we can confront COVID. And I think that is the right approach. And we are trying also, that means perhaps open science and more collaboration on science. So there, Europe and Malaysia will need to work more together in order to try to enhance this scientific cooperation, and also with all the ASEAN countries. Another area which is very important is globalization. We hear a lot about it. Will this be the end of globalization, or where do we stand on that? And as I said, it will not be the end. There will be a sort of different globalization, and perhaps we could put into question some of the issues that were there. One of them, of course, is the reconfiguration of supply chains, and you know, how vulnerable the supply chain has been, and in some cases broken. For example, in goods that are key for everyone, would have been essential medical goods and other more strategic assets. So, I mean, we all know, do you know that 40% of the antibiotics that are imported from Germany, France and Italy come from China? And that, of course, China produces 90% of penicillin, which is that's consumed all over the world. So the idea of no country that could be the source of a too big proportion of imports of key products. And that is, you know, what is on the big thinking in Europe today. How do we reallocate our activities to places that are more closer to consumption? So local production, shorter supply chains, more centers and not one center. So all these ideas, and Malaysia is key there as well, because we know you're a key producer of some of these medical supplies, for example, gloves. So how, you know, all these supply chains will come after this pandemic is something that Malaysia should also need to look at. We also look a bit more state intervention. There is a demand for state action, which is increasing. We see that in Europe, for example, in issues of unemployment, where the state and European funds have come in order to try to maintain and protect employees and workers. So how do you look at unemployment scheme, social scheme, something that also Malaysia will have to look at. More easing on flexibility of state aids has also been a measure taken by Europe, and therefore allowing more help, more support of the state in different industries and in different key sectors of the economy. And all this brings us to one key issue, which is strategic autonomy. And I think this is very important because we need to We need to look at issues like, what are strategic market segments do we need to be kept in Europe? Do we, for example, medical products, technology? So this is a big open thinking in Europe of how do we are going to organize this. We also have to look at foreign direct investment scrutiny mechanisms, and that was something that was already talked about before the crisis, and that will come certainly more. How we tighten controls on foreign direct investment, how we stop distortions of competitions outside the European single markets, and so on. And in any case, in any scenario that we are building better, you have to count with open trade. And open trade is very important, open and rule-based trade, which gives stability and predictability framework for our business. If we want to recover the economy, you need to have a stable framework. And therefore, we have the single market in Europe, which is our big advantage, one big market for 27 countries. And we have seen how important it is to respect it, because when crisis comes, people tend to close it. So we need to maintain that single market open, and that will be one of the work that is going ahead. Trade negotiations will continue. We have just finished and closed with Mexico, even in COVID, and we have also had negotiations rounds, for example, with our investment agreement with China. So that work is continuing, and also how to work to modernize WTO. We have seen in this crisis, for example, that we have suspended temporarily some tariffs on most of the medical equipment worldwide. So can we take that into another level to do it a bit more permanently? That is something that, Malaysia has also always been an open trade nation, and when are we going to see a more clear trade policy from the new government on these issues and maintain this openness that Malaysia has always been as a place for business, because foreign business are here and they need to be maintained here, otherwise to help in this recovery exercise. And finally, we are all speaking about what sort of recovery strategy are we looking at. In Europe, certainly we need to repair the damage, but also generate recovery. And that is being now just thought through. There will be a sort of recovery mechanism that is being now prepared together with a 7-year planning of our budget and our budget priorities. But that mechanism, in any case, will have to build on what was before, and that was a very big green and clean economy. And climate change and digitalization will be the 2 big pillars in any case. And that was the 2 agendas which were before in Europe. So again, we are not changing, but we are trying to bring them into the new framework. It will have to be sustainable, it will have to be clean, it will have to be, environmental friendly. And that's what everyone is looking. So Malaysia will have to use this, period to try to continue the transformation into a high-income economy, but also try to bring all these elements mainly in. I mean, it is about open markets, it is about local innovation and technology, much more effort. We have seen how difficult for all of us is to communicate, to get e-learning, e-commerce up and running, so that will be the new norm, but to change the business model into more circular, environmental, sustainable, friendly. And those are issues that we were discussing before, but come here even on the front line when we think of building better. But mainly, most of all, it's about international cooperation and solidarity. We also have to speak about solidarity in Europe. At the beginning, we didn't see that solidarity. Nations were looking into themselves, but now it's the only way. So that recovery fund will also have to have a big doses of solidarity. And that means also, my last point, solidarity with all the world. I mean, we shouldn't leave our main principles of multilateralism, human rights, environment, climate change aspirations. We also are working, to help other partners. We have put aside 20 billion already to react and help our partner countries, not only to treat the immediate needs, but also to look at the socio-economic repercussions. For example, in Malaysia, we are working with the vulnerable communities, to try to bring direct relief to them with all the projects where we had. And much more. And I know Niloy there has much more to say. We are in this together. So solidarity is fundamental, international cooperation. None of us can get out alone. So let us work for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I think that is a very strong message for international solidarity and cooperation. And indeed, we cannot do this alone. I'm also very drawn to the example that you have gave about how the European Union is trying to take this opportunity to build on what you have already been building on, which is the green economy, green and clean economy. And if I may share, like I recently also read a little bit about Franklin Roosevelt, the former US president during the Great Depression. He had a program called the Civilian Conservation Corps, where he basically put a lot of hundreds of thousands of unemployed young men to actually do reforestation work. And together they actually planted, I think, about 3 billion trees. So I just thought that was such a fascinating historical example that as we're trying to solve the more immediate problems, we can actually solve two problems at the same time. So I thought that was just amazing, and would love to hear a little bit more about your views on that as well. So for now, I will also I'll move on, and I would like to bring it a little bit closer to home, and want to zoom in a little bit more on the issues of accessibility to healthcare, and also building of a robust social safety net in Malaysia. So for that, I will call upon Dr. Khor Swee, who is a health system specialist. Dr. Khor, take it away.
Hello, Ivy. Hello, everyone. Assalamu alaikum to everyone, and I hope you all have a blessed Ramadan and also good fasting experience today. I'd like, not only do I want to bring it home to Malaysia, maybe I'll also center the Building Back Better exercise into space and time. So the space is, let's talk about Malaysia, but in terms of time, let's talk about the next 12 months or so. That's a reasonable in our post-COVID future that we need to, well, begin constructing even as we fight COVID today. I'll make 3 sets of comments. The first 2 sets of comments are Malaysian, and the last set of comments is about global collaboration, picking up the theme from Mrs. Maria later, Her Excellency Maria, who spoke a lot about global solidarity. So if you allow me, I'll make the first 2 points. Firstly, about Malaysia. We'll first talk about health reforms in Malaysia. Ivy and everyone, we're all very focused on COVID right now. But what COVID has done in Malaysia is also to highlight some of the, well, shall we say, gaps in the Malaysian health system. These gaps are clear and apparent for many people to see. We just haven't fixed them in the last several decades, 2 or 3 decades maybe. So it's only highlighting gaps that were in place for some time and then magnifying these inefficiencies. For example, I refer to the relative lack of hospitals, the relative lack of contracts for the doctors and nurses and pharmacists. And even during COVID, we're in a sense scrambling to provide contracts for them. And then maybe thirdly as well, the inadequate funding that has been given to the Ministry of Health so far. So health reforms are necessary for Malaysia. We know this for a fact. How can we make health reforms happen in Malaysia? Because COVID is just accelerating the need for us to have these health reforms. And here I offer the idea of a Health Reform Act. The reason of having a Health Reform Act and a parliamentary select committee that survives parliaments, that survives political transitions, survives pandemics, and survives changes in administrations is crucial for one big reason. Health reforms in other countries have traditionally taken between 10 to 20 years. And Malaysia, if we continue, shall we say, the political trajectory of Malaysia, we could be experiencing a period of instability. And that instability, if we set that aside, means that we cannot let it, say, impact the reforms in the health system. Therefore, we need something, an institution that survives any political transitions, because health, in a way, although it is political, it must be appropriately depoliticized. So I offer to everyone the idea of a Health Reform Act, accountable to Parliament, creating a parliamentary select committee just to usher in the health reforms to ensure that it will be long-term and sustainable and survives any political transitions. This is my main point in terms of long-term health reforms for Malaysia, how we can construct that post-COVID future, how we can build back better is by creating a vehicle that is accountable to Parliament and survives any transitions. Once you have that vehicle, multiple work streams, but there are 3 big work streams. The first one, to reform appropriately so the financing structure for health in Malaysia. Number 2, the way ministry hospitals are organized and structured. And number 3, human capital, which means how many people do we need, how many doctors and nurses and paramedics, and how do we train them, and how do we incentivize them as well. That is my first set of comments. How do we build that better for Malaysia in the long term? We need a Health Reform Act with a parliamentary select committee that can survive any political transitions. That is number 1. Number 2, let's talk about Malaysia's social safety net. And very specifically in Malaysia's social safety net, I want to introduce to everyone the concept of social determinants of health. Social determinants of health, or SDOH, some argue are much more important than building hospitals and medicines and vaccines and surgeries. Now, I'm a physician, I'm also a public health specialist. Hospitals are important. I love doctors and nurses and paramedics. All that is crucial. But assuming I had an extra R1 billion to spend, I would spend it on social determinants of health, such as education, such as proper employment rights and duties for the employers to take care of the people in the gig economy, for example, such as improving gender equality, such as water quality and air quality. So these are social determinants of health that are not really biological determinants of health. And some would argue that SDOH, or social determinants of health, actually contribute to as much as 60 to 80% of somebody's health status. My point being that there are people here, I believe, from UNDP and EPF. I see a familiar name from EPF. So hello, my friends in EPF. Your role is very important because that social safety net for Malaysia is crucial during a pandemic. We see the people, for example, who are going to pawn shops when the CMCO was essentially imposed yesterday, meaning that these people are running out of money. So if essential healthcare workers, for example, or cleaners in hospitals or nurses are considered essential workers during a pandemic, I put it to you and everyone in Malaysia right now that they should also be considered essential workers during non-pandemic periods. Therefore, the social contract between Malaysians will have to be rewritten. It has to be rewritten so that there's enough, say, duties of the rich to the poor, employers to employees, people who have versus those who have not. That social contract has not yet been rewritten in Malaysia for several years or decades even, and COVID is forcing us to wake up to the need for the rewriting of our social contract, also to buttress the social safety net that we have. Those are my second set of comments here about the social safety net, notably about the social determinants of health and how if I had an extra R1 billion, I will put that money into social determinants rather than building more hospitals. And finally, about how the social contract will need to be rewritten to renew the relationship between the people of Malaysia so that those essential workers are essential throughout time rather than just during a pandemic. We have to rewrite the social contract. So those are my 2 sets of comments, firstly about health reforms and secondly about social safety net in Malaysia. Let's speak a little bit about global collaboration. And here in partial response to Her Excellency's comments earlier, there will be a tension. The tension in the global community is a tension to globalize on one hand or to localize on the other. On one hand, we need to globalize because we need, say, global collaboration for science and vaccine development and the supply chain as well. All that is very important and we need to globalize. And yet, in Her Excellency's comments, she also hinted at some of the tensions that forces us to localize. For example, vaccine sovereignty, what is strategic autonomy, the concept of shortening the supply chain. If Malaysia, for example, a sovereign government, is not able to take care of our citizens and we lose our legitimacy as a result, there is really very difficult for the Malaysian government to contribute to global solidarity. And this is a problem that every country in the world faces, not just Malaysia, not just Europe. So that tension is something for us to really navigate very appropriately. But let's move on from that. Let's talk about global collaboration. Despite nationalism rising around the world or in any number of countries, pandemics like COVID is forcing governments to, heighten their nationalist sentiments because they do have to protect their citizens, and we understand that very deeply. But let's talk about global collaboration in 2 specific respects: scientific collaboration, and number 2, tax avoidance. There are many other ways that we can collaborate globally. Please allow me to just pick 2. The first one is scientific collaboration. Open source data sharing is all great, and I think we should accelerate that collaboration, because pandemics such as this and climate change that will come soon and the economic say downturn that will eventually come requires a global collaboration to understand that we are one species instead of a collection of 193 countries. So that is very important for us to collaborate. Certainly the scientific part is something that I'm very passionate about, and I'm glad that scientific collaboration globally has really accelerated. Let me pick on one more thread, which is tax avoidance, or shall we say tax justice. In multiple jurisdictions around the world, large corporations have billions and billions of dollars to spend. And I'm glad that they're able to contribute a lot of that money to the COVID efforts. But what we can also do is to ensure some form of tax justice so that countries in the emerging world or the developing world, or sorry, whatever term that you might want to use, will be able to benefit from those who are able to channel some money just to ensure that there is adequate amounts of tax justice. Now, when I say tax justice, you may think of it as a nebulous format, and let me centralize it for our listeners here in Malaysia. Malaysia is engaged in what some might call a race to the bottom. Our say wealth taxes don't exist in Malaysia, but corporate taxes and income taxes gradually come down. Why? Because we're competing for foreign direct investment. I will even use the word against other countries in Southeast Asia. So if Vietnam were to reduce their corporate taxes, if Singapore were to reduce their income taxes, then Malaysia will be forced to compete as well. And if Malaysia is competing by reducing our tax rates, on one hand it is good, but on the other, social safety nets, as well as the health system reforms cannot take place. So therefore, scientific collaboration is crucial. And number two, tax justice is crucial for the whole world. And I'm a fan of global collaboration. We definitely need to do that. So Ivy, let me just summarize the three sets of comments that I've made. Firstly, it's about Malaysian health reforms, and to ensure long-term sustainability, a health reform act accountable to Parliament. Number two, buttress the social safety net and consider all essential workers to be essential throughout time. And if I had an extra billion ringgit to spend, I would spend it strengthening the social welfare net. Number three, global collaboration is truly crucial, but specifically in two crucial terms. Number one, scientific collaboration so we can find a vaccine. And secondly, to increase tax justice so that, shall we say, emerging countries around the world and middle income countries around the world will be able to find enough funds that they can buttress a social safety net. Secondly, and firstly, improve their health systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khor. There was a lot of points to unpack there in a short 10 minutes time. I think you mentioned very interesting points about the need for health reform, but I think some might note that the health spending in Malaysia, I mean, one would question whether that is at a sufficient level or not, particularly that we have quite a sizable private hospitals in Malaysia as well. Perhaps you can talk a little bit about that. And your point about the social determinants of health is also very interesting, I find. I think that there is also a lot of, we also have seen in the past 1 month that there are a lot of families that actually live in very substandard conditions, and that would directly or indirectly also have an impact on their health. So some of these aspects should also be looked into. And finally, of course, the very pertinent point about going global, but also going local in our solutions. So I thank you for your remarks. And now may I now give the floor to Mr. Niloy Banerjee from the UNDP. And Mr. Niloy, I know that you have the UN together, UNDP and the UN has worked with your Malaysian counterpart on the Sustainable Development Goals. And I also read with a lot of interest a recent position note that the Asia Pacific Office has put out on the social and economic impact of COVID-19 in the region, where you mentioned a few points, including the need to prioritize to save life and also save livelihoods, and also the need to have maximize the budget and to minimize wastage, and then finally the need to build back better. So do tell us a bit more about what UNDP is currently working on and your views about this subject.
Thank you, Ivy, and good afternoon to all our audience, and certainly a big good afternoon to Ambassador Maria and Dr. SK. I just want to start off by saying this is, I think my previous two panelists have covered a very wide swathe of issues, and there's absolutely full agreement with all the propositions on the table. Let me then just maybe speak to a few sort of guiding principles which are steering our journey here. The first, of course, we are here to talk about building back better. And the one great opportunity we've had now, because COVID has shown us again that the impact of the disease is disproportionate, clearly, across different population groups. So clearly the principle of leaving no one behind that sort of underpins the sustainable development goals is absolutely key. The second is for us as supporting actors behind the government of Malaysia, we want to be very incremental, not big, grand, dramatic stuff. We will leave that leadership and bold action to the government of Malaysia, but we are here to provide sort of catalytic and incremental support. The third point, Dr. SK actually took it right off my bat, the issue of renegotiating the social contract. Clearly, we have to have a rethink of how we take care of employees, of citizens, non-citizens, the less fortunate, and that is something that there's a conversation to be had about that. And I think this is the moment in time when we can completely rethink paradigms here. A subset of that is really rethinking inequality. And again, as you saw, COVID impacts the less fortunate, the less well-off more. And also we saw a new facet of inequality emerge, which UNDP's analytical work last year has spoken about, the issue of technological inequality, digital inequality, and the fact that some of us could seamlessly switch to a digital work environment, whereas others talked about dying of hunger before dying of the disease. So there is a digital inequality issue that we need to re-examine, along with the overall question of inequality. And then the last point, if you like, is the one that both previous speakers have made. The UN Secretary General has spoken about solidarity, new partnerships, empathy, and there's absolutely no way anyone can do this alone. So just to also finally kind of touch upon this issue of that we are building the ship as we sail. So nobody really has a magic bullet. So some of the ideas we put forward are tried and tested, but some are also absolutely new. For example, how do we design the new social protection system? That's there are good practices around the world against which we can benchmark. But for Malaysia, we will have to do its own thinking, and we have to come up with our own sort of bespoke model for Malaysia. So let me maybe speak in sort of 6 buckets of ideas where UNDP, along with our UN partners and of course our other international partners like Ambassador Maria's organization, the World Bank and Asian Development Bank, for example, can come in with us. So sorry, 5 buckets is what I'm going to try and address right now. The first one is the focus on the productive sector, including informal productive sector, and also particularly looking at micro, small, and medium enterprises. This block of productive agents are very significantly important to Malaysia. They produce, I think, about 98 to 99% of all jobs, of all business establishments count as micro and small and medium enterprises. And about 70% of all jobs are generated in this sector. So, and you've seen that many of these actors have had to do massive layoffs or simply close their businesses, and with no assurance that they'll be able to come back because they don't have the ability or the savings to dive into and live through a rainy day, literally. So here we are looking to provide some platforms for exchange, where they are able to do risk insurance issues, where they're able to look at, for example, the rent forgiveness and rent reduction schemes that the government has offered. How do they access it? How do they benefit from it? If it's not adequate, where can they negotiate, for example? So these, this is another sort of area to look at. Also in this sector, to look at the repurposing of production lines. And we are working a little bit with the Malaysian Plastic Manufacturers Association to repurpose production lines to look at, you know, surge requirements, such as protective equipment. For the more informal sector, or the gig economy workers, again, along the lines of the last presentation, really to look at how insurance, risk insurance, and social safety nets can be rejigged in ways that this segment of the population, and don't forget, even the non-poor are vulnerable. The lower band of the non-poor will likely slide back into the below the poverty line. So there's a great deal of backslide that will also happen. So how do we build something that is better than what we have now? And then the final issue is of you know, how do we channel youth entrepreneurship through some mentoring and incubation support to be able to actually not only perform in a regular economy, but also in a crisis economy like the one we are currently facing. The next block of issues is actually the most difficult one, because this one involves macroeconomic and trade adjustments. I'll avoid the trade bit. I think both previous speakers have spoken, but again, the spirit of cooperation and solidarity is going to be paramount. But the macroeconomic adjustments, colleagues and listeners, this is going to be the most painful and bold areas of painful and bold action. And they are very deeply political economy areas, so it's not easy, and they need making tough choices. But we've seen the decline in aggregate demand and attendant impact in labor markets and supply chains. Low oil prices is now probably a new normal. Huge capital flight from developing countries. UNDP is just putting together the numbers, but this has been the largest ever capital flight induced by any shock from developing countries. So it's a big area of concern. And of course, Bank Negara, as you've read, have projected a GDP downturn of about 0.2 to 0.5%. So all in all, in such cases, in such a context, how do we protect fiscal space so that budgets continue to be directed at the less fortunate, the B40, for example? How do we protect the fiscal space to transition to a more green paradigm of economy, which Ambassador Maria spoke about? Because these will need cash, and this cash will have to come from investments, and these will have to come from somewhere. So there's again a leadership question and bold decisions, national decisions that come into play. So same with fiscal and monetary policies. Is there room for maneuver there? Debt restructuring, tackling the whole issue of debt in Malaysia. This is a big one because the current debt to GDP ratio is about at 51%, which is close to the constitutional limit, current constitutional ceiling of 55%. So that's an area that will need to be addressed and adjusted. And fiscal deficit is sort of creeping up to 5%. So it's, what kind of debt restructuring and debt rationalization is possible. And again, all of this, as previous speakers have said or alluded, needs international cooperation. It's not just going to be left to individual countries to figure this out. A lot of tax cooperation, for example, is international. The so-called termites, transfer pricing, for example, is an international issue. Tax havens is an international issue. So this is the tough one. Going to a more another sort of dividend that has emerged from this unfortunate situation is of course, the digital dividend, e-commerce, e-governance, teleworking, telecommuting, and of course, all of this in turn requiring a genuine legal and regulatory regime that will need to be put in place. E-commerce, for example, has immense potential for bringing back the large Malaysian cohort of highly educated women who are outside of the labor force for caregiving and family responsibilities in unpaid economies. So telecommuting policy, likewise, if the government can do a pilot, and it will already enable many mothers and women taking care of children or families at home to actually participate or re-enter the professional economy which they have dropped out of. And Malaysia has a very large number of that cohort. E-governance is a very big area, and Malaysia's the flying start. The Malaysian judiciary, as you saw, did e-hearings in the last couple of weeks, and more to come, actually. A whole sort of dispensation of justice using the digital tools and algorithms. A fourth area is rebooting the national, subnational, the decentralization and localization of development, that conversation. Unlike the local, the national impact, there were local and micro impacts as well, which have been much more harder to capture, and they have been different. What Kuching felt was very different from what Taiping felt and what Penang felt, and how this crisis impact each of them will be different. So a more risk-informed, localized planning using techniques of foresight, but also using local data sets. National aggregate data sets are good and useful, but when you want to do local planning and impact reporting, you need much more local data sets. Civic engagement and bringing civil society into local planning processes and the overall governance space is another big opportunity. Likewise, creating networks of local governments, discussion spaces alone, and learning spaces, very, very important. And then finally, the transition to green economy. Ambassador Maria already spoke about it. This may be the time, because oil prices are so low, to take a very hard look at fossil fuel subsidies. Because if fossil fuel subsidies were removed incrementally, because of the pricing of petrol and diesel and all other fossil fuels, the impact on household expenditure will not be dramatic. So it's a good time to have that conversation. I know it's politically fraught. Investing in sustainable energy, no-brainer, I guess. It's solar, biomass, and those are also job creators, incidentally. And again, telecommuting has shown that we ourselves can reduce pollution load. Human beings can very consciously reduce pollution loads, and similarly localizing this, shortening the supply chain and localizing. So and now there's emerging evidence that managing the economy, managing the environment better can actually prevent the what are called zoonotic diseases. So all interesting sort of moments in time, or many interesting points of inflection, which hopefully we can come together and build as one species, as Dr. SK said, and move on to sort of maybe not a full reboot, but certainly a partial reboot of our ways of life. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Niloy. So I think we've heard a lot of really good points made by our three speakers, and I feel that it certainly dawns on me that we are really dealing with a lot here. I mean, one is sort of the potential issues that we'll face. I think Mr. Niloy has touched about the issue of inequality, and in the light of a more and more digitalized future, there will be a digital gap where that would potentially worsen the inequality issue. And then you also brought into the notion that it's not just the poor that needs help, but also some of the non-poor, the N40, and it really brings into questions this whole idea of having more economic resilience, and not necessarily just talking about low-income households, but also the middle-income households. And then at the larger level, then we also talk about the risk of having a very nationalistic approach and a protectionism. How do we deal with that? But on the other hand, we also talk about sort of the opportunities that we might have. We talk about sort of, you talk about the opportunities of having e-commerce up and coming, and the potential of it actually helping to create high income jobs, and also having there's also a gender aspect where more women can be encouraged to join the workforce. So I think I'll be opening up to answer the Q&A, but as the moderator, I will obviously take the opportunity to ask the first questions. And I really want to bring into the picture a little bit more about the role of government. And I think Your Excellency have also said that it seems that people actually want to see some state intervention. And it really certainly doesn't seem to be a time where leaving it to the market force will work. So people are yearning for a stronger response. And I'm also, very drawn to what economist Maria Mazzucato has said, where and I think Your Excellency might be familiar with that because she has actually drawn a report for the EU, where she basically argues that government must invest in areas for innovations that would create promote social goods. So where in the past, government investment has helped to bring into light the creation of internet and GPS, where eventually private sectors will then prime the private sectors to actually follow suit to invest more money. So I think when we talk about sort of build back better and steering the country's economy to the right direction to be more people-centric, more resilient, and more sustainable, what is the role of the government in that? And then my second question would obviously also be what is probably on a lot of people's mind, which is how do we finance all this spending, and how do we finance this recovery? So how do we make sure that we spend enough, we do enough to save us from recession, but at the same time also exercise fiscal prudence, which we must also examine what does it mean to be fiscally prudent right now. So I'll open it to our panelists if you have anything to say. Sorry, let me unmute you. I think you can unmute yourself as well. Right, okay. anyone can.
All right. Okay. Maybe Ivy, I'll take a first shot. Investment in social goods as well as fiscal space to finance social goods. You know, this is the one I said was the most difficult of all the interventions we've named. I think all three panelists have named it, because it requires that old cliche, political will. There is fiscal space available. Malaysia has the cheapest prices of petrol in the whole entire region. And now it's a small part of the spending basket of the average petrol consuming Malaysian economy. And with lower prices even more so. Is this the time for a rethink on fossil fuel subsidies? I know there's been years of infrastructure investment. Many resources are tied up from different sources in fossil fuels, but is this not the time? I mean, we have had a continuous conversation about a transition to renewables and moving out of fossil fuels. Greening the planet, literally, you know, moving away from brown paradigms. So clearly that is something to think about. There is also room in looking at tax regimes. There is only what 15% of Malaysians pay income tax, which is better than the peer group across Asia on average, but still, if you see the number of Mercedes and BMWs on the streets in Klang Valley, it doesn't look like 15% should be paying income tax. There should be a little adjustment there. Similarly, corporate taxation, avoiding the race to finish, the race to the bottom that SK talked about. And price undercutting, etc. We really need to come together behind the government's leadership on this, but also where organizations like Ambassador Maria's and mine can help is forging maybe the sub-regional solidarity. So there is cooperation across borders, and then also the maybe at the regional level as well, and global. Some tax havens are way outside of Asia, but you know, tax havens are holding considerable wealth, as you know, from Asia. So there is room. Maybe we need to create safe political spaces for government, like the idea of the Parliamentary Standing Select Committee which makes it kind of party neutral on many issues. Could be something that we really need to think about. And to be fair, Parliament has invested in it in the last year and a half or so. And I know because UNDP has been involved in not exactly this committee, but on health, but the whole process of looking at parliamentary select committees and standing committees. So I'll maybe leave it at there. And
thank you. Your Excellency?
Yes, well, certainly first on the role of governments. I mean, we have seen it very clearly. There is a sort of demand for more state action in many countries. In Europe, for example, there are in some countries the issue about minimum wage. You know, in countries like mine, Spain, this issue has come also to the front line. Do we try to have a minimum wage? Some countries like Spain have tried it. And especially in times of crisis, to have this social net to certain parts of the population that we are. The issue of you know, of all the systems we have when many of the people have gone now out of jobs in Europe, they have been supported by systems, by funds that come from Europe or from the national states, both of them, which allow them, you know, not to be unemployed, but sort of in waiting. But that gives them also a social net. So that's why I was referring to a resurgence and a bit of state in times of crisis, but also in state aids. Many companies, industries, manufacturers have all gone to state, say, can you help me? The stimulus package the government is bringing in is to help instead of for the companies, SMEs, which are in much more need than others. So how do you, if you do it in a way which is well regulated, protective, is fair and equitable to everyone, accessible to the ones who really need it, but you need to have all this insurance as well. In regard to finance, I mean, I've also mentioned, this is about pooling resources. It's an unprecedented crisis. We will all have a lot of increased debt, and our fiscal space will shrink in every country. We are looking for money. We need more money, but you need to pool resources and you need to show solidarity. Look what happened with the vaccine. You know, it's to find a vaccine, which is how we are going to fight this pandemic, is costly, very costly. So you need to bring out, and not only governments, this where we also had philanthropic, we had all sorts of actors, foundations, people that just wanted to contribute to that, and mainly to make it accessible to all, because, you know, we need a vaccine that needs to be able, everyone has to be, how do you manufacture it afterwards? So we will need companies also on board, the big pharmaceuticals also to have the share and make also this accessible and distribute to all. So it is in that moment where, like in Europe, we have to pool resources together. We need to, this recovery fund will have to show elements, big elements of solidarity, because this pandemic has not, been equally to all countries. And it's the same, it doesn't touch so heavily in countries and others. Yes, it depends also on how you were beforehand, how your social systems, your health systems that Dr. Khor was referring, how were they and how can they, be able to have the capacity to deal with this enormous health crisis that has suddenly come and without anyone expecting. So to be prepared and how you change the systems, but it will require resource pooling, that in any case.
Thank you, ma'am. Dr. Khor, if you have anything to add?
Your Excellency, muchas gracias. I love the European Union flag that you have in the corner of your room. And part of the beauty of the European Union flag is that the stars are all equal, and it's a sign of solidarity between every country, shall we say, in the European Union. As we consider in Malaysia, what we can do to be in solidarity with our, say, brothers and sisters in Southeast Asia, Asia Pacific, and the world, I think the flag of the European Union probably reminds us of the importance of solidarity. So I definitely am in solidarity with you, Your Excellency, about that sentiment. Let me share a few thoughts, if I may, drawing from philosophy, from history, from economics and politics. With a caveat that I'm none of the following, right? So I'm not a political scientist, not an economist, nothing, just an average citizen, just curious about the world. The global system of capitalism that we have today is very young. Young in the sense that humanity, our Homo sapiens species, is about 300,000 years old. But the global capitalist economic system is only since 1945 or so. If you go back to Adam Smith, then it's around the 18th century or so. So that's about 200 years or so of say, capitalism emerging with the rules that we understand it today, really only emerging after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990. Therefore, what this pandemic has really done for all of us in humanity today is give us an opportunity to consider rewriting those rules. I'm reminded also of Oscar Wilde, who was asked once a question, how did you get bankrupt? He was asked, and his answer was slowly and then suddenly. So it could be that global capitalism is important and it's served its purpose, but in historical terms, it's now COVID rather, the pandemic, gives humanity an opportunity to rewrite some of those rules. Some of those rules needs to be rewritten in incremental ways, like Niloy has mentioned just now. Some of those rules may require to be written in very quick ways, for example, some at nation state in Malaysia levels, and some at ASEAN levels, and some at United Nations levels. Sometimes in discussions by the Trade Commissioner, for example, of the European Union, or Competitions Commissioner of the European Union, because entities like this actually set standards for the rest of the world in terms of, say, tax jurisdiction, tax avoidance, tax havens. Fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of the responsibility goes to, shall we say, the P5 members of the United Nations Security Council, also the larger powers of the world, if I can use that word. So these are the geopolitical considerations. The historical considerations are such that we, as capitalism, as we know, is only quite short. And this pandemic has suddenly woken up a lot of people to the need that has gradually built up over the years to rewrite those rules. Now that's very philosophical, historical, economic, and politics, and geopolitical. Let me center and zoom down into Malaysia, and we will just look at maybe just one example, and we'll concretize the more airy-fairy, more idealistic language that I have provided earlier. And the question is from Kaula Fadzil. Terima kasih, Kaula. Kaula's asking about the elephant in the virtual room today. What do we do about migrant workers in Malaysia? And when you say migrant, Kaula, I imagine you to mean both documented and undocumented. Let me talk about the documented migrants at the moment, right? The undocumented migrants requires a very large conversation. And those, say, principles and concepts and historical trajectories that I mentioned, how can we apply them here now? And we can apply them here now by understanding what Niloy has mentioned in his very first slide. There are no magic solutions, no magic wands. So it requires a basket of solutions. So with migrants, lots of people have to play, right? So let's talk about them in very brief terms. Firstly, civil society, NGOs, concerned citizens, and activists, your role is very clear. Secondly, the public communication needs to take place, and the people in the NGO space needs to collaborate with media and build a coalition of the unlikely, or to find unlikely allies in that cause for migrant health. And you may find migrant health, right, overlapping a little bit with environmental health, overlapping a little bit with prison reform, and so on and so forth. So there will be an unlikely coalition that you can build. That will be number two. And number three, including the media. And number three, build, say, connections to both sides of the political parties, because Malaysia might be entering a period where we have coalitions exchanging powers, just like many other countries in the world where there are two parties that exchange power, so to speak, exchanging administrations. Then therefore it becomes imperative that we teach, educate, inspire, motivate, encourage, peer pressure, shame, whatever the verb might be, two sides of the politicians, so not just one, but both, or even the third or the fourth or the fifth. And therefore, when these politicians come into power, the political will that Niloy has mentioned and Her Excellency has also mentioned comes into play. So that's how we, shall we say, not miss this crisis of COVID, because COVID is drawing a lot of things into the surface. We've gradually built this up. This is a crisis not to be wasted. So there you have it, a little bit of the idealistic commentary and translating a little bit to the migrants one. No easy solutions, but we have to be mindful that this crisis is an opportunity. Thank you, Ivy.
Thank you very much. So let us try to answer some of the very good questions that have been posed. I will pick two for now that is related to the issue of deficits. One is from, okay, so this question asks, do you think the increase of in public debt and deficit will put Malaysia particularly at a disadvantage, such as affecting FDI in the long term, given that most countries globally were likely to see a similar deterioration of their public finance? And there's another one that is also somewhat related, is about the global supply chain. With the global supply chain not deemed viable, with advanced nations reshoring their manufacturing, what should trade-oriented nations like Malaysia do? I open it up for any of you that might want to add anything on this.
I think I had a reply to the global supply chain one, saying to him that, you know, we need to maintain, as I have said, in any scenario, open trade is fundamental. So we need to continue, you know, to ensure that the supply chain is working, that it's, even there will be big readjustments, that we maintain, you know, an open and rule-based trade system. It is time, therefore, now to work in Malaysia to be part of what could be the modernization of WTO, we have been trying now, for example, to develop some sort of arbitration arrangements that could allow, to maintain the dispute settlement function working, and would be good that Malaysia will be part of these countries like Brazil and China are biggest users, and they are part of this agreement now. So be part of the global efforts to that all nations in order to maintain trade links open, because it will be very important for Malaysia to continue to be an important regional trade and international hub, and also because that will attract more foreign investment here. And at the end, they will need also foreign investment in order to recovery. And there are already, for example, more than 2,000 European companies in Malaysia. They are Malaysian companies. They hire more than 250,000 jobs, local jobs for Malaysian people. So we are a part of Malaysia's economy, and therefore, we need to be consulted, be part of a stimulus, and this is if you want to continue to maintain the companies here, and if you want to continue to to attract more. These companies, many of them are regional hubs and manufacturer hubs. They are doing, a lot of them were doing parts of all these medical devices that were necessary and were asked for in all the countries in the world. And that reputation Malaysia has to make efforts to maintain.
Okay. Thank you. So let me just also run through some of the questions. There's a question from Kia Hui who asked about the inequality issue. I think this is for Mr. Niloy. It's quite a long question, but I think what she's asking is how can we sharpen the approach and the social protection products with a more targeted approach that will be required for effectiveness, and how does that tie in with the sustainable development goals? Another related question for Dr. Khor is on what are the things we can change about health insurance in a healthcare reform in light of the experience of this pandemic? Any of you can go for it.
Niloy, if it's okay with you, I will go first. Oh, but he's on mute. Niloy, you're on mute.
SK, did you want to go first?
Sure. No, you go ahead, please.
Oh, okay. Okay. Sorry, on the social protection and inequalities question, I think, look, some fundamental rethinking of social protection needs to happen. The first big debate that economists have had on this is the question of whether a universal basic income can be applied across the population without worry for inclusionary errors, meaning if you have included an M40 person, not to worry too much about that, but to totally focus on exclusionary errors, i.e. who is falling out, who is not being included in a social safety net. So I think Ambassador Maria was already hinting a little bit about, the European models of compensating incomes through some sort of a social safety net, which is universal. Targeting, as you see in Malaysia, there are about 26 different social protection schemes run by different ministries, and quite unwieldy, because it's hard to track through a central database who's getting what. So sometimes double dipping happens and triple dipping happens, and some are totally excluded. So there is a distributive inefficiency there, which can be addressed. So targeting can happen through a different lens, which is maybe through basic needs. As again, the point I alluded to, many daily wage workers such as food delivery, motorcycle drivers lost income. They were not necessarily in the super poor category before COVID and the restrictions, but now they've lost income for 50 days. They are definitely sliding back into poverty. They'll have to borrow from friends, family, or the money lender. A pawn shop, somebody mentioned the race to the pawn shops yesterday. So it's this group will now need to be covered by some social. So universality of risk insurance, universality of social protection. And therein lies the whole renegotiation of the social contract that SK so eloquently brought out. You know, we have to really rethink how we do this, how the privileged are, who are increasingly getting away from the rest of the population, who continue to remain tremendously vulnerable. A 50-day shock, and there you are. The other thing is what you know, we really have to fundamentally look at education and health systems, because look, the technological, digital inequality I was talking about, let's be very honest, if you're born in a construction laborer family today, versus if you're born in a family of two professional parents, one say a professor and one an engineer, you from day one, you will have an advantage in life, because you're getting equipped with tools and you're imbibing information, you're having access to gadgets, and you're listening to conversations which are very different from what you're hearing in a B40 unskilled laborer household. So there you are. How do you, you know, how this is, and these two children will grow up with very different cognitive skills. Right from age 4 or 5, they'll begin to show different numerical and other skills because of just the context, even before they've set foot in the school the first day. So a rethinking of how the new climate change will impact food prices, for example. Food prices will rise. Who does food prices impact most? The poor, because it's the biggest part of their consumption expenditure. Elderly who have saved up a certain amount of pension, thinking they can live out their life on that money. If food prices triple, that pension is not going to be enough. So again, a rethinking of social contract based on very humane solidarity terms, not on hard-nosed economics. The time has come, and this disease showed us in 50 days that we are not in control of everything. Over.
Dr. Khor, you want to add something?
Niloy, thank you. Not to add so much to the eloquent speech I was given by Niloy just now, but if I can center the conversation to answer Sharon's question, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
Sharon Lee has a question. Thank you, Ivy. Sharon has a question about what we can do to change health reform. To change health insurance and healthcare reform in the light of this particular pandemic. So a short answer and then a longer answer. Short answer is Malaysia needs to have more health insurance along the broad themes of insurance for the insurable, or to provide more insurance for those who can be insured. So that's the brief answer. Sharon, I'm absolutely supportive. Here are some details. We begin with a 50-40-10. That number represents the way Malaysia spends on health financing. 50% comes from general taxation, so income tax, wealth taxes. And by the way, to Mr. Chua's question, I'm in support of a wealth tax in Malaysia. Currently does not exist, but I'm in support of it. So 50% of how healthcare is financed in Malaysia comes from general taxation. 40% comes from out of pocket, when the World Health Organization recommends that it should be only 20%, meaning the high risk of people going bankrupt because of medical illnesses is very high in Malaysia. And up to 20% of all bankruptcies in Malaysia take place because of a health condition. So it's 50 tax, 40 out of pocket, and 10% insurance. So that number is very low, 10% is very low. Therefore, we need to expand the insurance to the insurable in a few specific categories. Maybe we can take them in sequence, starting with the employed, perhaps starting with 1.6 million civil servants to purchase insurance for them. It could be as little as 1% of their salary per month, or something along this number. The more people you have, the lower the premiums would be. Start off with government servants and then go on to pensioners. And then number two, start off with all employed people in the formal sector. And then thirdly, allow the informal sector, for example, guilds to come in, the taxi drivers, rubber tappers association. So one by one, we can add sectors to come in. What this means is that Malaysia cannot go a big bang that we insure 32 million Malaysians. I'll talk about migrants in just a second. We insure 32 million Malaysians first on day one. That's impossible. So we need to scale up by one sector by one sector. So the migrant sector, we obviously need to start with the documented migrants, and such an insurance scheme is already provided through something called SPIKPA or SPIKPA under Perkeso or SOXO, the organization. We can expand that, and then we can hopefully bring in, shall we say, the undocumented migrants at some point. I do note that they bringing in undocumented migrants, although great from an ethical perspective, humanitarian perspective, public health perspective, and I am supportive, we need to move carefully given the political considerations, which is not only in Malaysia, but also in every other country. So that's a long answer for how we can, shall we say, have more health insurance in Malaysia. Thank you, Ivy.
Thank you. Okay, I think we are running a bit short of time, but we still have quite a few questions here. So I think that it's open for any one of you to answer. And there's a questions about how it's a really long question, but I think essentially is asking about how we can make sure that we have sustainable development by adopting green and clean technologies instead of going for quick fix solutions like starting for other automotive industries or something that is fossil fuel oriented. So that's one question. I think related to that question is also one on carbon tax, whether carbon tax would be a good mechanism to fund some of the initiatives that have been spoken. So I will leave that to any of you that would like to answer. And I think that just to, before you wrap up, maybe we can also answer Sumitra's questions. And her question is whether there is any countries that you think have gotten their approach right with respect to health reform and social safety protection. I think that perhaps we can also expand this to not just health reform and social safety protection, but really more generally also in other aspects of the response to the post-COVID-19 rebuilding. Okay, so anyone has anything to add about the questions on carbon tax and green and clean technology before we wrap up?
But at least sustainability and green has to be part of any recovery mix. Certainly will be part of the one at the EU level and the EU countries. What we are trying to do. We are looking, and the goal is still there, to be carbon neutral in 2050. So that is a big effort which was there before, and I think is still on the table. We will see what are the proposals that come out in some weeks' time on the recovery fund. But certainly the Green Deal, as European Green Deal is much, will be part of the big recovery mix of Europe. And at the end, you say, who has done it right, who has not done it right? I think that's not the issue. The issue is we need to talk. We need to, countries, actors, they need to talk more, they need to share more, because many things depend on how, society or economy of a country is, or of a group of countries. But also there are many things to learn. We can learn things from Malaysia. Malaysia has a very low number of deaths for COVID, for example, if you compare it to other European countries where that has been explained. And it's not an issue, climate or not climate, it's warmer or not warm. I think there is a lot of things that we need to share and this is a time to talk. So I come back to my first point of cooperation, and alone, as Niloy said, alone we cannot do it.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Dr. Khor, so anything to add and also to wrap up?
Sure. Perhaps not about carbon tax, although I'm also in favor of carbon tax because a lot of major policy decisions require a disincentive, incentive, carrot stick approach so that we can change human behavior. So narrowly about carbon tax, and I'm absolutely in support. It may seem in my conversations and thoughts that I shared today that I'm a health system specialist, and that is true, I am. But a lot of the elements about health actually exist outside the domain of health. Therefore, we need economists to come in, we need sociologists to come in, we need welfare specialists to come in. We need people who have, say, a clear understanding of making policies about, say, social safety nets and carbon economics and education policies and migrant health and prison health. So you see, very little of that is health related. And yet, if you do that well, my job, well, you know, I don't have a job because nobody gets sick in a sense, right? So you don't need doctors, you don't need nurses, you don't need hospitals. So if I were to ask everyone here listening in for a favor, please help out the doctors and the hospitals and the nurses and the health system by doing whatever it is that you're doing, bringing in health where necessary, and your success will be the success of health. We don't need hospitals, we just need more people doing really well in whatever it is that you have chosen to do. Thank you very much for listening in. You are much more important than the health system. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much. Mr. Niloy?
Maybe just answer the question that I think is addressed to me about whether anybody would bother to you know, reboot the economy and production systems now. As opposed to when, you know, actually a kickstarting of economies by any means is important. I mean, look, livelihoods and jobs are absolutely important, and no, that's why I kind of stressed incrementalism right at the beginning. It's, but this pandemic has shown that there are many things we do that are not absolutely essential. There are many utilities we use which we could rethink. China, for example, is simply incentivizing now energy efficient cars. It's not a reboot, it's not a complete redesign, and it certainly does not impact the production and jump-starting the economy. But there you are, a small incremental tweak using this moment in time to rethink some of our models and renegotiate how we inhabit the planet, and maybe also renegotiate how we letting this moment pass and go back to business as usual will be a huge mistake. And that's what the new normal that everybody is talking about. This is the moment to imagine that new normal and with Maria's solidarity.
Thank you. I thought that was a very nice way to wrap up our session today, that business as usual is no longer acceptable. We need to reimagine our new normal, the future that we want, and we must also do that better so that we do not repeat the mistakes of our past and reinforce the failures. So, and of course, to do that, we are not alone, and we need to do it together, and that is the message that Your Excellency has been stressing over and over again. So with that, I thank you all very much, and for the panelists for all your views, and also thank you for those who have joined us for this 1.5 hours. I hope you enjoyed it and have some good takeaway. Thank you again, and please continue to stay safe wherever you are, whatever you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivy.
Thank you.
And thank you, Ambassador and Dr. SK.
Thank you. Thank you, Niloy.
Thank you, Excellency. Thank you, Dr. Khor. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you to all participants. Thank you.
Thank you.